This is a story that Molly Ivins told. A story, she said, originally told by a friend of hers named Johnny Falk, who used to tell a story about when he was a Texas Ranger, a captain, in fact. He was 7 at the time. His friend, Boots Cooper, age 6, was the sheriff. And the two of them used to do a lot of heavy law enforcement out behind the Falk place in South Austin. One day, Johnny's mama, having 2 such fine officers on the place, asked them to go down to the hen house and rout out the chicken snake that had been doing some damage down there. Johnny and Boots loped down to the hen house on their trusty brooms, which they tethered outside, and commenced to search for the snake. They went through all the nests on the bottom shelf of the hen house and couldn't find it, so they both of them stood on tippy toes to look at the top shelf. Now, I myself have never been nose to nose with a chicken snake, but I always took Johnny's word for it that it will scare the living daylights out of you, which this one did. Scared those boys so bad, they both tried to exit the hen house at the same time, doing considerable damage both to themselves and to the door. Johnny's mama, Miss Falk, was a kindly lady, but watching this from the house, it struck her pretty funny. And she was still laughing when the captain and the sheriff trailed back to the front porch. Boys, said Miss Falk, what is wrong with you? You know perfectly well a chicken snake cannot hurt you. And that's when Boots Cooper made his semi-immortal observation. Yes, ma'am, he said, but there's some things that'll scare you so bad, you hurt yourself. The sermon right there, right? All else is commentary, but naturally I can't resist. First of all, we have a capacity for fear for a reason. This emotion helps keep us safe. A person without fear is very likely to soon be a dead person, an injured person, an attacked person, and so on. The unpleasantness of this emotion motivates us to do what we need to do to keep ourselves safe. I have my fear-motivated list of things to never do again. You probably do too. I will, for instance, never again walk a railroad trestle. Explore sea caves in a storm tide. Drive into a flooded ford. Let my dog run off leash in an unfenced field. These are good decisions. They protect me and things I love. But I have to remember that just because it feels like fear doesn't mean it's actually fearful. Our bodies are hardwired to fear snakes, even the ones who can't harm us. It's in our genes, and it takes a concerted effort to get over it, and sometimes we just have to do that. Our fears are also important because they tell us what matters to us. We fear for our lives, for our loved ones, for our values, for our nation, for our legacy, for our comforts, for our property. We may feel sorry for the people of the war-torn Middle East or for the violence-torn streets of South Chicago, and we may understand their fear. But unless we know some of them, we will not fear for them. Fear has its good sides, but it is not good for our bodies. It fills us with the hormones of fight and flight. It revs up our hearts. It reduces our peripheral vision. It pumps blood away from our thinking brains and into our muscles so that we can fight or run. And if we do fight or run, these reactions dissipate and all is well. But fight or run is not the appropriate set of options for dealing, say, with your fury about electoral politics or your fears about a warming planet. So unless you turn off that TV and go for a brisk walk, you are going to stew in your body's anger juices, and they're not good for you. Anger is closely related to fear, and in this society, it's easier to display anger than fear. We get angry at threats, from the clear and present driver who nearly crashes into us while texting, something I know you never do yourselves, and which therefore makes you even angrier, to the somewhat more removed, but possibly more life-changing political candidate that you're sure will ruin the country or embody values you despise. Anger has its place in the world. It can motivate us to action, just like its cousin, fear. But anger and fear must be acted on to be healthy. Appropriate actions taken out of anger and fear gain energy from that emotion. But living in anger or fear, stewing in anger or fear, that's not good. Not only do those emotions make us miserable, they are states of our body awash in hormones and chemicals, which in the long run are very bad for us, for our health and for our well-being. Anger is harder on our bodies than fear, and both can be soothed to some extent by recognition. Saying to yourself, "I'm angry," and identifying the source of our anger, which should always include, "because I am afraid that," not only gives us good information, it gives us a perspective. We can then evaluate just how threatened or angry we need to be in this situation. We can evaluate, and once we have started to talk to ourselves about what we are feeling, all that thinking in itself reminds us that we may feel angry, we may feel afraid, but we are bigger than our anger or our fear. I've never been much of a fan of Franklin Roosevelt's "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." For it seems to me that, at least in the short term, there are all kinds of things to fear, all kinds of threats to our well-being and our ways of life. When it comes to our political life, though, it does often seem that we hurt ourselves because we're so scared. Looking back on September 11th, 15 years ago, and all the things we feared on that day, it's not more terror that's damaged us very much. It's our fear of more terror. The towers have been rebuilt, the Pentagon's been fixed, air travel is resumed more or less like before. Some lives were changed forever. But even most of those people have adjusted. But our nation has changed. We went to war out of fear, and that war and the wars required to fix its unintended consequences have been damaging young lives and costing the body politic ever since. Ironic, isn't it? In 2001, we feared that the world around us was spinning out of our control, but actually it was our own society and our own selves that we were not able to control. It was not foreign air passengers that we needed to fear. It was the inner workings of our own psyches and those of our neighbors, and how those could be exploited by the powerful and that ended up hurting us the most. It turned out to be true, what Nazi thinker Albert Goering said, that democracy or not, fear rules. Voice or no voice, he wrote, the people can always be brought to the bidding of their leaders. It's easy. All you have to tell them is that they're being attacked and denounce the pacifists for their lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works that way in any country. And so it seems to have worked in ours. This is sobering. We thought we were better. Another comment. Human beings are notoriously poor at assessing risks and threats, which are the things that make us afraid. After 9/11, for instance, for a couple of years, people's fear of flying kept them out of the skies, but it did not keep them home. Instead, they drove. They drove lots and lots and lots of extra miles to grandmother's house and to business meetings and to Disneyland. And because driving is considerably more dangerous than flying per mile traveled, even when you factor in possible terrorism, a lot of people died who statistically would not have died if they had stuck with the friendly skies. We knew this when it was happening, but it didn't change anything. You can read entire books on this particular problem of human nature, which is sometimes, when we're so scared, we hurt ourselves. Social scientists tell us that people are hardwired to believe their leaders when they feel threatened, just like we're hardwired to fear snakes. This probably helps us to follow a strong leader in an emergency. But when fear is not situational, but around us all the time, this trait leads us around by our noses. When we are afraid, we focus on peripheral, superficial cues. We don't follow complex logic. Only what we feel matters. If it were a real crisis, we wouldn't have time for complex logic. But in our day-to-day lives, being afraid leaves us vulnerable to those who will take advantage of it. We have to be careful when we're feeling scared. Because after all, it is in the best interests of an unpleasant assortment of rascals to keep us fearful. Those who want to sell us on dubious ideas, those who want to sell us on dubious products. And further, since our media, our entertainment, to an increasing extent our news sources, are paid for by clicks and ratings, it is in the best interest of those on whom we rely for information for our critical thinking to keep us fearful. Because the more fearful we are, the more we click, and the more we click, the more they get paid. Whether it's the weather or the latest disaster, the more fearful we are, the more open we are to any authoritative message. And the simpler the better, and the less able and willing we are to actually think about what that message means. I will leave it to you to work out for yourselves the consequences of those trends on today's political life. And because I want you to do that, I want you to stop and think about this for yourselves, I will tell you something else. Be not afraid. Fear is an emotion. We're not in complete control of it. But we can influence ourselves and our state of mind, and in the case of fear, we should. Because if we're afraid of the wrong things, we're liable to hurt ourselves and those around us, just like the boys in the chicken house did themselves damage in their hurry to depart the premises of a snake they both knew perfectly well wouldn't hurt them. Martin Luther King once wrote a sermon on 4 steps for dealing with fear. He knew whereof he spoke, of course, as a person who had walked through gauntlets of barely controlled rage, who had lived with death threats himself and against his family, and who was part of an organization which coached ordinary people like you and me to face their fears and walk calmly into them. First, King admonished his congregation to face their fears, admit them, and ask themselves what they are really afraid of. Because you can't fight an enemy you don't understand. Secondly, he said we can attempt to master our fears and go on anyway. This involves us in the discipline of courage, which is not a lack of fear, but rather the ability to carry on productively in spite of fear. And that trait, courage, is increased by practice. It's good for us to practice overcoming our small fears. We do it by reminding ourselves of all the things that we value. A soldier who runs into the line of fire to save a comrade is a soldier who is in touch with her belief that much as she values her life, first and foremost, she is a good friend and comrade. A demonstrator who braves a line of furious counter-protesters is in touch with the fact that in spite of what feels like terrible danger, what is more important is his cause. No small number of persons, scared as most people are of public speaking, have decided that what they have to say to their fellow UUs is more important to them than their fears, and they've come to this pulpit and sometimes with a shaky sort of voice have said it. Our Unitarian father, Ralph Waldo Emerson, once said that one who is not every day conquering some fear has not learned the secret of life. That's actually the quotation with which King started this particular sermon. He wanted his people to be ready for what faced them. Attending to and overcoming small fears is a good practice. Thirdly, King reminds us that fear is mastered through love. When we see the people we fear as vulnerable human beings with wants and needs and hopes and dreams, different as they might be from ours, still pretty much like ours, our compassion is engaged and we cease to be afraid. Finally, he said we confront fear with faith. Faith in the larger goodness of things. It gives us an inner equanimity to deal with what we need to deal with. Most of us share that faith, whether we believe that this is the nature of the universe or the nature of God's world. We believe there's a larger goodness to things even when our life seems to be out of control, and we can find some kind of serenity within that belief if we work at it. And it takes work. It takes analyzing our fears. It takes engaging our higher faculties that remind us of what we have decided is the meaning of life and our true values and our true self. And it takes being in touch with our compassion. It's important for us to face our fears, not only large fears like fear of death, but smaller fears like our fears of social disruption that could come from terrorism or the proliferation of guns in our society. It's important for our own ability to live serenely, and it's also important because the courage and ability to wisely do what needs to be done in our world is a social necessity in times of crisis. The fact is that we have many things to fear besides fear itself. But our fear itself is what is in control. And until we have dealt with that wisely and well, we cannot be all that we are meant to be, and we cannot bring all that we have to bring into our life together. Closing hymn this morning, we're going to sing 3